Hello, my name is Dr. Sean Riley. I am a physical therapist and a certified wound specialist, and today I'm going to be talking about the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, as well as their roles within the endocrine system. A couple objectives for our lecture today. We're going to explain the interrelationship of the anatomy and functions of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. We're going to identify the two hormones released from the posterior pituitary gland, their target cells, and their principal actions, as well as identifying the 6 hormones produced by the anterior pituitary gland, their target cells, their principal actions, and how they are regulated by the hypothalamus. So we'll start off by explaining the hypothalamus, which is located in the diencephalon of the brain, just anterior and inferior to the thalamus. So it has both a neural and an endocrine function, and it's going to produce and secrete many hormones. Now we understand the hormones are going to play a role in that endocrine function, but the neural portion of the hypothalamus is what plays a role in helping to control the pituitary gland as well. So the pituitary gland is a bean-sized organ suspended from the infundibulum or pituitary stalk. It has an anterior and a posterior lobe. The anterior lobe is often referred to as the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is the neurohypophysis. And as you can see, the anterior lobe is just a little bit larger than the posterior lobe here. So the hypothalamus-pituitary complex is often known as the command center of the endocrine system. It's because it secretes several hormones that directly produce responses in those target tissues. They also regulate the synthesis and secretion of hormones in other glands. So not only do the hypothalamus and pituitary gland have a direct impact on their target tissues, but they also have an impact on other glands and their production of hormones. So this slide provides kind of an overview of the hormones produced from the pituitary gland, separating them from the anterior and posterior lobe, as well as the intermediate zone with the melanocyte-stimulating hormone. Now, as we move to the right, we see the name and the abbreviation of the hormones that are produced, their chemical class being either a peptide or a glycoprotein, and then a short description of their effect for each hormone. So we're going to start off at the posterior pituitary gland. Now, this gland releases oxytocin, which is abbreviated OT, and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So these hormones are going to be stored and released into the blood via the capillary plexus. Now, while this may be an elementary concept, we have to realize these hormones are being produced and they're being circulated through to their target tissue through our blood flow, and that's where that capillary plexus comes into play. So we start by talking about oxytocin, and this often is known as the hormone that's going to stimulate the uterine contraction and dilation of the cervix. So it's going to be continually released during childbirth through a positive feedback mechanism. After the child is born, it responds to the newborn suckling to create an increased milk production. So oxytocin is often known as a hormone that has to do with pregnancy, childbirth, and soon thereafter. However, we have seen increased oxytocin levels when we're experiencing feelings of love, closeness, as well as part of the sexual response. Now we move on to antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and this is released in response to high blood osmolarity, and it's often impacted by an excess of sodium ions. Now, an interesting thing about antidiuretic hormone is that it can be released at an increased rate even after having a meal that is high in sodium ions to bring the body back to homeostasis. So what ADH does is it targets the tubular cells of the kidneys, allowing for increased water reabsorption. So what happens as we get this increased water reabsorption, that water is being reabsorbed into the blood, and it's going to reduce the concentrate of solutes. So it's going to reduce the concentration, in this case, possibly of sodium ions in the body. So by doing this, we actually increase the hydration of the body, reducing the concentration of those solutes, and therefore bringing back our osmolarity to a more normal level. So this is going to be, as it suggests, antidiuretic hormone. It's going to work the opposite of a diuretic that a patient or an individual with, say, congestive heart failure or kidney failure is going to experience, that swelling of the extremities. Now, it's also known as vasopressin in some areas because it has, in high concentrations, it can actually increase your blood pressure by increasing that peripheral resistance, by increasing the water concentration in our blood. It causes more pressure within the arteries and therefore increases our blood pressure. So those are the two hormones for the posterior pituitary gland. As we move to the anterior pituitary gland, again, this area is going to produce 6 hormones. And the hypothalamus is going to produce separate hormones that are going to either stimulate or inhibit hormone production. A lot of times we think about stimulation of hormone production, but in order for us to stimulate, we also have to be inhibit. We have to be able to wrangle something in if we're going to increase it in another manner. So we'll start out with one that's pretty commonly known as growth hormone. It promotes protein synthesis and tissue building through direct and indirect mechanisms. It's going to stimulate the liver to break down glycogen to glucose, and this hormone is going to be controlled by the hypothalamus, whether it is that growth hormone whether it is the manner that increases the amount of growth hormone or inhibits the amount of growth hormone. Those are those two things that are coming from the hypothalamus there. And growth hormone is often released during sleep. We have our thyroid stimulating hormone, which is going to trigger the secretion of thyroid hormones by the thyroid gland, and it's going to operate as part of a negative feedback mechanism. So it's going to constantly check if there is enough of this hormone and then adjust as needed. Our adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, it is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex to secrete a corticosteroid hormone such as cortisol. It is regulated by the hypothalamus in response to physiologic rhythms, and as you can imagine, cortisol being one of the corticosteroids being secreted, it is often released as part of the stress response. We also have our gonadotropins, so these consist of follicle-stimulating hormone as well as luteinizing hormone. So follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the production of and maturation of our sex cells, so these would be ova in women and sperm in men. Now the luteinizing hormone is going to trigger ovulation in women. It's also going to produce estrogen and progesterone by the ovaries. And in our males, we're going to see an increased production of testosterone in the testes. Lastly, we have prolactin, and prolactin promotes milk production in women. It contributes to development of mammillary glands during pregnancy and milk production after birth. And it is inhibited by a dopamine neurotransmitter in non-pregnant women. Now, as you can imagine, if we're not pregnant, we don't have much of a reason to produce milk, and therefore this is not going to be a very active hormone in this case. So, as these hormones can sometimes be confusing to us and we need lots of work with them, I did include some review questions. So we see here, which of the following is an anterior pituitary hormone? Remember, we have 6 from the anterior and 2 from the posterior posterior pituitary gland. So we have ADH, oxytocin, THS or thyroid stimulating hormone, and cortisol? And the answer would be TSH. Then I also asked the question, which of the following hormones contributes to the regulation of the body's fluid and electrolyte balance? Adenocorticotropic hormone, antidiuretic hormone, luteinizing hormone, or all of the above. And as we remember, our antidiuretic hormone is going to help regulate the body's fluid and electrolyte balance by resorbing some of that water back into our blood flow and therefore helping dilute some of those solutes. I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for listening to my lecture today. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.